Let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. This is session 178. Today, we'll focus on pedestrian and foot traffic. There's an old planning thing everybody talk about. We manage what we measure. But in transportation, over the decade, we measure cars pretty well. We measure bus, we measure trains, but we do not measure pedestrian that much. So today, join me Professor Andrew Sevtsuk, Professor Rounaq Basu, and Jascha Franklin-Hodge for a panel discussion on what's the modern methodology is enabling us to measure pedestrian flow much more accurately. But then how can we translate this measurement, these models into actions through the planning process? I'm really great to have the three panelists. I will invite each of them to introduce themselves very briefly, 30 seconds each. We'll start from Andres.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andres Sevtsuk, Associate Professor of Urban Science and Planning in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, and also lead the City Design and Development Group in our department.
Thanks, Andrew. Rounaq?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rounaq Basu. I am an assistant professor in the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Tech. I like to think of myself as a plan engineer. I have a background in transportation engineering and urban planning. And my work focuses on how to reduce auto dependence, get people out of cars, encourage more walking and biking. Thank you.
Very nice. Rounaq is also MIT alum. Jascha?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jascha Franklin-Hodge. I'm the former chief of streets for the city of Boston, where I served with Mayor Wu, for Mayor Wu, managing transportation and public works. Prior to that, I was the executive director of the Open Mobility Foundation, an organization that helped cities use data and open standards to manage their transportation networks. I have a background that spans transportation and technology, and I'm always interested in how new tech and data can support local government in delivering great services.
Wonderful to have the panel here. Before I invite Andres to start the presentation, I want to reiterate the norm of this forum. That is, everyone contribute one idea to the forum. Everyone here are specifically referring to the audience. I'd like to invite everyone to type into the chat your question to the panel or comments to the presentation. Again, in the chat, welcome people to put your favorite city into walking into the chat so the panelists can get a free sense of what we're talking about. Andrew, I'll share the forum with you now, please.
Thank you, Jinhua. And can you just let me know if you can see the screen okay?
All right. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you for inviting us to talk about this research. This is a project that has been ongoing with a level of partnership with folks at the New York DOT as well. It revolves around a paper that we recently published in the journal Nature Cities with the reference up here. Today, it'll be just me and Rounaq presenting the research, but the broader research team involved also Liu Liu, who's a PhD student at MIT, Aziz Al-Hassan, who graduated, and then Justin Koller, who graduated. And Rounaq was also a postdoc in the City Forum lab during this work. So I'll start off by talking a bit why might we care about modeling foot traffic in cities. Jinhua already alluded to this idea that we can manage what we count in transportation, and one could even on a more value-based level say that what gets counted counts, because a lot of funding allocations, a lot of time and effort allocation when it comes to urban infrastructure depends on what we have information on. What do we count? And despite the fact that walking is the most ubiquitous form of mobility, it is the least studied across all modes. And in cities like New York, it's actually the dominant mode. In New York, 41% of all trips are on foot, which is far ahead, for instance, of the auto trips that are 28%. So that in itself, I think, is an important starting point. But what do specifically pedestrian models allow us to do? Most cities have some level of data about foot traffic at different locations, including New York, which in fact has foot traffic counts at over 1,000 locations that have been collected over various studies by the DOT. what the model specifically allows us to do is to extrapolate, use this count information and extrapolate an understanding of foot traffic volumes to virtually all streets in the city, or even more precisely, all sidewalks, crosswalks, and footpaths in the city, to yield something that may be familiar to you as the AADT measure in car transportation, but more precisely as a peak hour foot traffic volume for pedestrians, which can vary by day of the week, or it could even vary seasonally. In itself, this allows us to make better decisions. It allows us to invest into better sidewalks or public spaces at locations where we know it'll impact the most people. So rather than, for instance, using public complaints as a way of allocating sidewalk investment monies, which is also a way of many cities doing it, one can direct public investment into places where most foot traffic occurs, or where most foot traffic of particular kind occurs. For instance, where people who have no other choice particularly need to walk. Additionally, this also constitutes an important normalizing factor for lots of different hazard data in cities, whether it is traffic crashes or urban heat, noise pollution, air pollution. Most of such hazard data produces very different spatial distribution estimates if it's in raw form, as in most crashes occurred, versus in normalized form, where we use the foot traffic estimates as a denominator, and we'll show an example of that, which can have direct policy implications. And perhaps most importantly, since we're talking about a travel demand model, models also allow us to forecast. They are not just explaining what is or what was, but they can be used as tools to change the built environment and forecast what would happen if certain developments were permitted, if certain streets were renovated, if land use is changed, population changed, and so forth. So with that, I'll go through the framework we've developed. This builds on about 10 years of modeling work that we've done in the lab and research group using urban network analysis, which is a kind of a very fine-grained traffic modeling or mobility modeling set of tools designed explicitly for modeling pedestrians and cyclists over networks. It's been a plugin for various software platforms, and most recently it's a Python library that's openly available as well. We use this software platform to then estimate active travel in a kind of a three-step modeling process, which can then be combined with additional steps for impact assessment or design intervention analysis. As in all models, the first step is data collection and setup, which requires data on travel behavior, person characteristics, or built environment where travel occurs. For that, data usually comes from trip generation understandings, which inherently tend to be more biased towards auto trips. So a lot of our understanding of trip generation is very geared towards auto trips, but we're starting to understand from various surveys, and more recently travel surveys that have been done on mobile phones, also the travel demand for active mobility in more detail. There's also a wealth of information in such travel surveys about destination choices and how far people are willing to walk, etc., all which can inform the travel behavior side of the model. On the built environment side, we need to have an understanding of where people can walk, that is the pedestrian infrastructure, and also what are the potential origins and destinations of mobility in a city. For this particular study for New York, we ended up combining various sources of data to develop the first citywide routable pedestrian network dataset. It's basically a data set of sidewalks, crosswalks, and footpaths that covers all 5 boroughs of New York. And it was combined from various sources, including some of our own generation using computer vision, and then humanly verified on 2019 aerial imagery to make sure that it corresponds to the conditions on the ground. The land use data comes from various sources, ACS data, info group data about jobs and amenities, transit locations, transit station entrances, school locations, and so forth. Once we've set up the data infrastructure, we use the UNA framework to develop preliminary estimates of pedestrian trips over the network. And I'll exemplify this with a starting trip for one simple kind of trip. This is trips coming from a single census block in New York, which is surrounded by these 4 dots, going to the nearest subway stop. And the way it works in this model is that we don't represent the census block as a centroid. We partition it to 4 frontages in order to gain higher spatial resolution. And then don't assume that people take the shortest walk. In fact, the framework finds all plausible routes people can take to the nearest subway stop. So that's why you see multiple routes going there. In this case, all routes that are up to 15% longer than the shortest route. And there's a destination choice model, which uses the Huff destination choice model to allocate the probabilities of how many of the trips go to which entrance. There's 2 entrances in this particular subway stop on 176th Street. This then can be expanded to not just the nearest subway stop for this trip type, but to all possible subway stops people can walk to around this particular home location. So there's a destination choice model that allocates trips between different candidate destinations depending on their accessibility and attractiveness. And further, this can then be expanded citywide to examine one particular trip type here, which is the home to subway trip type. This will yield basically a kind of a preliminary estimate of how many, or where would trips distribute on the street network or sidewalk network for the home to subway journeys. There are, in fact, a range of different trip types in the model. We can feed them in as part of a pairings table. And these can be trips between homes and schools, homes and subway stops, homes and bus stops, jobs and subway stops, jobs and restaurants, jobs and retail amenities. There's a whole list of origin-destination pairs that goes into this model. And this list depends on time of day. It can be different in the morning peak hour versus the lunch hour versus the evening peak hour. We developed the model for 3 time periods on both weekends and weekdays. So there's total 6 estimation periods. And I'll just flip through a few of them as examples. For instance, the amenities to amenities trips are estimated on the left between various ground floor businesses, homes to amenities trips, homes to jobs trips, etc. Not showing all of them. Once we've then estimated a dozen or more trip types as they distribute over the network with preliminary trip generation rates and distribution assumptions, we go into a calibration phase of the model, which adjusts these trip generation and distribution rates vis-a-vis the foot traffic actually counted on city streets of New York to fine-tune them and scale them. And I'll hand over to Ronak to explain this part.
Thanks, Andres. So I'll pick it up from the third step that we see, model calibration. So by now, we've obtained estimates of how many people we expect to be walking on each link in the road network, given the surrounding land uses, given the network infrastructure and particular attributes of the network infrastructure as well. So we were working with New York City DOT, who shared their pedestrian count data with us. These counts were collected largely manually, and on the right, you see an image of an Excel file showing how the counts are being recorded. So that's one of the challenges, a very practical challenge we had to come up against. These counts are not digitized. And you can see that we have counts for these different kinds of turning conditions along the crosswalks in the image. So we had to manually digitize every single Excel file that we got, and we had over 1,000 locations. So this was certainly a large team effort on our part. Next, please. So we looked at over 1,000 locations where we had pedestrian counts collected on weekdays, and we also looked at different times of the day distributed across the morning peak, the midday, and the afternoon peak. And similarly, we also had just under 500 unique locations where we had data for weekend counts as well. We focused only on count locations that had a reasonable number of pedestrians walking, and we defined define that as at least 30 per hour to weed out locations where we did not have enough people walking, which would serve as outliers in our model. And these data were from 2018 and 19. So that's pre-COVID, just keeping that in mind. Next, please. So I won't belabor you with the modeling results, but what I do want to call attention to here is a couple of things. One, we used a random forest model to fit the estimates that we had obtained earlier to these counts. So that's the process of model calibration. What we see over here is that the model did very well, as it's supposed to, particularly for models such as random forest on the training data. So it did a very good job in trying to match the counts that we had in the training data set. And when we looked at data that the model had not seen, that's the test sample, the performance did decline a little bit. However, we did see consistently better performance during the weekday, regardless of which time of the day we were looking at compared to the weekend. Part of this could be explained by lower sample sizes during the weekend, but part of it also points to the greater variation in the types of walking and the types of trips that we see. So that's harder to explain because we see more varied trip making during the weekends, whereas weekday patterns are easier to put into a single bucket, if you will. Next, please. And then we're going to show you a few maps looking at what these calibrated flows look like. So for example, this is a map showing weekday evening peak volumes, calibrated, of course, across the entire city of New York. And then we can zoom in. Next, please. Yes, so we can zoom in and look at particular links over here. So when we say links, it's not just the sidewalks that we see, so both sides of the street, but we can also obtain estimates of the number of people who are walking for each crosswalk. So that's really an innovative addition that we haven't really seen in previous literature on this part. Next slide, please. And then we looked at these combinations. So we had the 3 times of day and then separately for weekday and weekend. How are our calibrated counts lining up against the observed counts? And we found pretty good alignment in terms of our model being able to predict higher volumes on links that actually had higher volumes. So we see that the alignment is pretty good with at least 89% match and up to 92% match. Next slide, please. So I'll show you a couple of applications. So now that we have link level estimates of the number of people who we see walking, how can these volume estimates be used for planning and policy? So the first application that we want to highlight is going back to that first slide that Andres had. We can use these estimates as normalizing factors for hazard. And I'll highlight an example that's relevant for Vision Zero, focused on safety. So a lot of Vision Zero efforts recently have been looking at crash data and trying to identify hotspots where we find concentrations of crashes. These lead to the formation of high injury networks that we use for planning. For example, on the left, we see these hotspots emerge in downtown and midtown Manhattan. However, when we apply that normalizing factor, we see that the hotspots emerge in entirely different locations. So we have not accounted for exposure on the left, right? We are not accounting for the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people walking in downtown and midtown Manhattan, and as a result, we are likely to see more crashes. But once we apply that normalizing factor, we see the hotspots emerge in locations where we also have higher concentrations of communities who have been historically marginalized, who do not have access to good transit. They need to walk to get to transit. They're at the end of the transit networks, and who also have very poor pedestrian infrastructure in terms of missing sidewalks or broken sidewalks and so on. Next slide, please. And then the last application I'll highlight is how we can use this framework to forecast impacts of external changes. For example, next slide, please. I saw a few comments in the chat where we were talking about pedestrian-oriented development. So we can look at pedestrian-oriented development using this framework. We know that NEPA requires new developers to do traffic impact assessments. And with this framework, we want to encourage cities and policymakers to require pedestrian impact assessment so that we can measure greenhouse gas mitigation contributions from developers. Perhaps we can provide tax incentives for developers to build in such a manner that more pedestrian and biking infrastructure and activity can be supported around those new developments. Next slide, please. And then finally, how do we connect the land use and transportation dimensions around pedestrian activity? So rather than thinking as in the paradigm of trying to predict and provide, our framework allows us to change that paradigm and rather think about this in a manner of deciding and providing. So let's decide on what we want our target mode share to be. As Andres mentioned, right now in New York City, it's 41% of trips that are being done by walking. So let's say we want to achieve a target of 60%. How do we enable that? What land use changes and where would be required to help us hit that target? So this framework can be used to engage in those kinds of scenario analyses. Next slide, please. That's not to say that this model or any other pedestrian model out there is completely foolproof. There are certain challenges. There are many more than the 4 listed here, but I do want to highlight these 4, and hopefully that'll spark some discussion afterwards. We have not done a good job overall as the modeling community to look at recreational trips, where travel for the sake of travel is why people are moving, right? So we are looking at specific destinations in our modeling framework, thinking about this travel as an induced demand. So, okay, we want to get to a certain place, perform a certain activity, and those are the kinds of trips that we are modeling. Now, thinking more broadly about the land use and transportation interaction modeling frameworks, how can we integrate the work that we have done, which focuses exclusively on walking trips, and think more in a multimodal fashion? There are tons of data sets, and there's a lot of investment in obtaining AADT estimates, annual average daily traffic. However, we don't really see an analogous effort to collect AADFT, so getting similar estimates for foot traffic, which would enable a lot of pedestrian oriented planning. And similarly, thinking about level of traffic stress and level of service, we don't really see an equivalent effort to look at this for pedestrians and even bicyclists. So that points to the need for better collaboration between modelers and policymakers. And I'm very glad that Jascha has joined us today, so we can probably dig into that a little bit after the presentation. So that's all I had on our end. We have our emails listed here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us afterwards. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ronak and Andres. Jascha, academics did our job, right? What else do you want as a chief street person here? Tell us how can we use this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Jinhua, for having me here, and thank you, Andres and Ronak, for such a great bit of research. I'm jealous of the folks at New York City DOT having this great data set at their disposal. I wanted to talk a little bit about just what I see as some of the practical applications here and some of the reasons why I think this kind of work is very exciting for cities. The good news is that I think cities have become much more data-driven in many of the investments that they make. This is particularly true around safety. And so, many cities have adopted the Vision Zero program. And one of the key components of that is measuring your high crash network. That's really like where are the corridors and the intersections with the highest crash rates by mode. But the big challenge with that is, as was alluded to, by Ronak, is that it's missing a denominator, right? So there's obviously value in reducing the absolute number of crashes in a city. But when you're only counting the number of crashes, you tend to over-index on the biggest and most complex intersections. And it turns out those are often the hardest and most expensive to fix. These are places with a lot of trade-offs associated with doing something to improve the pedestrian realm, and a huge cost due to the size of the intersection and the signaling complexity. So just as a benchmark for that, when we looked at Boston's 2 highest pedestrian crash intersections, the cost is roughly $5 to $10 million to fix those intersections, and is likely going to be a many years long planning process. So by taking a denominator of pedestrian volume and using that to help normalize risk, that has the potential to identify a lot of intersections that are simpler and where lower cost interventions might be very effective in reducing risk. And so that could allow you, with a given amount of dollars and time, that approach could allow you to do more interventions in more places and potentially even create a greater overall reduction in pedestrian crashes. $5 to $10 million could potentially allow a city like Boston to do interventions at dozens of smaller and less complex intersections. Now, it's still important to work on the big ones, but I think just being able to really, kind of do that bang for the buck calculation on safety is incredibly important. Another thing that's very exciting about this work is, we often see this dynamic in the city where there's a very uneven distribution of requests for government services. And we try to be very request driven and very responsive, but that sometimes means that we're not allocating our resources equitably. And so, an example of this is in the world of paving. It's the request for paving improvements is often very poorly correlated with the measured pavement quality. It's much more closely correlated with the income in the neighborhood than it is with the actual need for paving. And so thinking about a layer of pedestrian volume data would allow us to gut check, where are we doing work? Can we validate that, either by validating that a neighborhood concern or need is something that should be prioritized, or in some cases to push back if we're being asked to do work in a location that maybe is important for somebody in that neighborhood, but not reflective of the broader need of the neighborhood or the city. A couple of other uses that I think would be really interesting explorations with this data. So when we do any kind of signal, significant signal work, retiming or rephasing a signal, there's a tremendous amount of analysis around vehicular delay and a lot of trade-off analysis if you're choosing between different signal phasing strategies for an intersection or a corridor. You can look at like, okay, if we do it this way, it's going to benefit these movements at the expense of those movements. But there's very little sort of robust pedestrian experience analysis that is integrated into that kind of signal planning, despite the fact that signal phasing has huge impacts on pedestrians. So thinking about how pedestrian flow data would allow a city to integrate pedestrian delay, level of service into the trade-off analysis that goes into choosing phasing, I think could deliver a lot of value for pedestrians. And then last idea is just thinking about this as a tool for prioritizing maintenance of pedestrian infrastructure. Ronak showed that they're able to identify counts at individual crosswalks. Well, deciding, okay, when do we restripe a faded crosswalk, or how do we prioritize, if we have 500 faded crosswalks, which ones do we do first? Which pedestrian ramps do we repair first if there's a large volume of ones that need repair or maintenance? This kind of data could be a very useful tool to making sure that the city is doing the most good for the most people. And the last thing I will leave you all with is just an idea for sort of something to be looking at in the future. And a few people have commented this in the chat. I think David Cohn said, modeling is important. It's not where people walk, but where people could walk if the facilities existed. And I think about that in my own experience because I don't always take the fastest path between A and B. And the reason for that, can vary, but often I'm willing to walk a few extra blocks if it means I'm walking on a nicer route. And that could mean a lot of different things to different people. Whether how safe it feels, does it have shade? Is it noisy? What's the character? Am I walking up a hill? This is especially true in a city like Boston, where the lack of a street grid kind of obscures often what is the shortest path. So people tend, I think, to walk in ways that just reflect their personal preference in addition to an efficiency optimization. So I think that's an area of exploration of trying to layer some of that kind of data into a data set like this. It would be interesting to compare predicted preference of a model against the revealed preference. That might actually help identify areas where there's either very high quality pedestrian infrastructure or where the pedestrian realm needs investment because people are choosing a longer, less efficient route to avoid a certain area. So I think this is a really robust and rich area for further exploration to help cities with their planning efforts.
This is wonderful, Jascha. You just raised the 4 possible new research papers that Andreas and Rounaq could write on this. So Andrea and Rounaq, please offer some quick response to Jascha's part.
Well, thank you, Jascha, first and I really appreciate your on-the-ground expertise in Boston too, which I think is doing a lot compared to a lot of American cities. Boston has a pretty high walk mode share as well, and a lot of people ride transit, so these go hand in hand, and I'm a fan of what the city has been doing in the last decade. A couple of notes. This idea of the last one you mentioned of incorporating street qualities and sort of the revealed preference versus the predicted preference. In fact, that's part of the framework already. We didn't really have much time to discuss today, but we use this concept of perceived walking distance, which is different from the geometric walking distance or minimum time. And the perceived walking distance can, in fact, depend on how nice the walk is or how dangerous it is. There are both positive and negative attributes of streets that people can gravitate towards or be repelled away from. And indeed, the model can actually account for that. And when it routes trips, it can route trips taking into account what we know from pedestrian path choice studies and route choice studies. And then the point about prioritizing sidewalk repairs too, that's, I think, very low-hanging fruit for a lot of cities. In fact, we've already played around with this in Seattle, where you can basically develop the priority queue for sidewalk repairs, curb ramps, cracks in sidewalks, obstacles, etc., and just front-load the queue with things that will unlock the most latent accessibility. That will basically impact the most people most immediately and give them access to destinations they need to walk to. And I think that would just help fine-tune where we do repairs in a very impactful way, so that each repair will immediately impact the most possible demand for walking. So I'll leave it at that and see if Rounaq has something to add.
Thanks, Andrew. Rounaq?
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Andres shared and just offer a few thoughts. Related to the pedestrian experience, we have looked at, as Andres mentioned, several elements that affect the pedestrian experience and come up with this measure of perceived distance. We did not show that here for New York, but we have looked at it in many cities around the world. And I saw some comments about, well, it would be nice to have a tool that could tell us more about shade and comfort and so on. So I have never owned a car in my life. I walk everywhere, take transit, and that's a big source of discomfort for me as I walk. And I decided, well, let's change that. So my research group is about to launch an app that provides recommendations on the coolest, greenest, and the safest routes. So our first version is going to focus just on heat and shade and greenery. And then in the second version, we'll also include perceptions of safety. There are some projects that are going on in both Boston and Atlanta where we are working with the MPO and the city DOT to move beyond high injury networks, thinking about how to embed pedestrian experiences, thinking about near misses, for example, thinking about network gaps. For example, we can identify, well, are a lot of people doing mid-block crossings when the crosswalk simply doesn't exist, overlaying that against crashes and trying to identify where changes in infrastructure could provide the biggest bang for our buck.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions from me. The first one is, it takes years to develop a methodology, a model, and implement throughout New York, right? So how much would it take to, let's say, do it in Denver? How much additional effort to replicate that, right? And also more question to maybe Jascha or all the panel, how do we institutionalize this, right? We shouldn't rely on just a research lab interested in pedestrian to do this accounting. Can we do this systematically across cities, cross institutions, right? Both questions. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a lot easier to apply a model in a new city than to build a new model. My lab is currently involved in developing actually a foot traffic model for the whole state of Maine, 142 towns of Maine. And the most of the effort, of course, goes into data preparation and collection, because the model is already there and it's relatively easy to replicate in a new context. But getting the data ready takes still a few months at least, typically. It depends on how easily accessible various land use and origin destination data is. And in some contexts, we prepare sidewalk network data sets as well. The other big bottleneck for model building is the calibration data. Not all cities keep a tally of foot traffic counts. And I try to emphasize with all the cities I work with that that should just become the norm. As you count traffic, as you install loop detectors and cameras for traffic and spend millions of dollars on that, just do that for the people who walk too, because that's, on your strategy documents, you officially have oftentimes adopted goals that you want to shift, mode shift travel towards more sustainable outcomes, transit riders, walkers, cyclers. You have to count them. Otherwise, there's just, you're not measuring what you care for, as we like to say. Somebody in the comments also highlighted that, if you want to do precise models on sidewalk level rather than road center lines, which are easily obtainable, at least in North America and with OpenStreetMap globally, then sidewalk networks are also something that is not easily available. And we've worked with a number of cities to piece them together. But I'm delighted to share that the US DOT actually came up with a new data standard just this past year. I was part of the working group, but there is now a data standard for how sidewalks and bike routes ought to be mapped as networks and topologically connected. This is kind of they illustrate the goal. Now we're going to have to do the hard work of actually getting us there and developing a countrywide pedestrian network, countrywide cycling network, and do that globally. I think it'll be an exciting period to do that, but all these data layers are essentially needed to make sure that cities can track what happens in active mobility consistently.
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say Andres hit on, I think, two of the biggest challenges here. One, it's very exciting to hear that you're doing this work at a statewide level in Maine, because I think one of the biggest hurdles that cities face, even larger cities, even more sophisticated cities, is just to have the sort of infrastructure to form a partnership with a researcher or to develop a kind of system for containing data that's coming out of a modeling exercise like this. And so the more that the states and state DOTs can incorporate this into their own sort of set of resources that they provide to cities, I think the more likely it is that this is going to get utilized, and perhaps even tying certain funding streams to the use of data like this. So, for example, making a pool of resources available to cities that want to invest in their highest pedestrian volume aspects of their network. Those kinds of incentives can help create the sort of mental habits and the routines of using this data in the day-to-day work of cities. I think the other piece of this as well, Andreas talked about, was data standards. And, just right now, we have certain things like pavement condition index that are well established. And because they're well established, there's lots of different ways to get the data. They are used by multiple layers of government. It's a lingua franca of pavement. It's not the best measure. It has lots of issues, all of that, but it exists and therefore it is used. And so I think the more that this has a standardized approach similar to AADT, then it can be integrated into analysis. Third-party consultants can pull data or do analysis, related to, say, a development project or a road redesign. There just needs to be a kind of shared understanding that can then be used to kind of capitalize on this in all the different ways that we've talked about.
Great. Yeah. Rounaq, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that Gatis is fairly new, and I saw Justin put the link in the chat, so feel free to peruse that. I'm working on creating a network for Metro Boston in the Gatis standard, so we'll soon have an example of what that looks like, and of course that's going to be available open source for everyone to play around with it. And coming back to the topic of setting up ped and bike count programs. I think it's very important for us to also emphasize these counts that we do either manually or more efficiently in an automated manner. Yes, we have access to data from, let's say, Streetlight or Replica that do provide some data for us to work with, but it's always good to validate those estimates using field data that we can collect ourselves. There are plenty of examples of count programs, state of the practice count programs across the US. I used to work at the Boston region MPO, and I had set up their ped bike count data program as well, which is taken off, and we're doing this across Metro Boston. So there are plenty of examples out there. If you're wondering, how do you set this up, or how do you understand what the best practices are?
Right. You know, this discussion reminds me when DeepMind they developed this AlphaFold. They started with the protein they folded. At one point, Demis Hassabis said, why not we just model all proteins that are known to human beings, the 200 million of them, and they just did everything in a year and provide for free for people. This, right? I hope someone, I don't know, someone from foundation give Andrews and Rounaq, your team, some funding. Let's just do this across the board, right, and share it, right? So that's reminds on that. The second question for you guys is, I think Jascha, you mentioned the suppressed demand, right? Yeah, this is kind of a common planning fallacy. Like in bus planning, we say, oh, look at how much bus demand are there. Oh, then not many people use buses, therefore we don't plan buses there. I mean, that's exactly the reason people didn't take buses, right? I guess the same thing happens in pedestrian as well. But for pedestrian, I want to even push even further. I would think not only the supply should match the current demand, the demand, meaning the number of walking trips per day per person, should itself be an objective from a public health angle here, right? Can we say whatever your current pedestrian trip is, if it's below a certain threshold, there's something wrong with the neighborhood. Why people don't walk here, right? Use that as a metric and then match with the facilities and all the infrastructure, etc. This. I'd like to get your thought on is this too outlandish or this is a reasonable request?
No, I think this is right on, Jinhua. I think that it's really a power of models to actually reveal this latent demand that we don't see. Because if you take let's say that you have a network that assumes that streets are wonderful, and then you model it, you get a lot of trips in the neighborhood, but in reality, the counts reveal that nobody's walking, even though destinations are available, even though there's a mixed use, high density neighborhood, etc., then you can probably see the effect caused by horrible street conditions. And estimate what the sort of latent demand is if you were to fix the infrastructure on the sidewalks. However, more often, and I think this is something that's close to my heart, more often the problem is not on the quality of streets, but it's in the spatial structure of our cities. Throughout the last 120 years now, we've built cities around the car, and we build them fairly low density. And so the bigger problem we face is that in the United States, for instance, we have massive amounts of suburbs with wonderful sidewalks, all built to the spec of the mobility and what's it called? If you're a wheelchair user, the cities can get basically sued if you don't provide the infrastructure. There's I'm blanking out on the act.
Americans with Disabilities Act.
Exactly, Americans with Disabilities Act. So sidewalks are great. The main problem is there's nowhere to walk to. So we in policy conversations very often focus on, let's put in a new bike path, let's put in a new pedestrian path, and that'll make the neighborhood better. These are all great, but by and large, the bigger problem is that we don't have environments where the origins and the destinations are close enough for people to walk. And that's a zoning and land use and development problem. And I think that that must be part of the equation moving forward, is to kind of, if along your remarks, Jinhua, if we aim to get a certain step counts, 10,000 steps per person every day, then part of the solution certainly must be land use planning, and to bring environments into condition where that would normally or naturally occur. And that's I think an important nuance there.
If we can get to that 10,000 steps per day, all the doctors will love you And
Yeah.
so that
Should be a Surgeon General recommendation, right?
There actually is. So the U.S. Surgeon General's office released a report called it's a call for more walkable communities. I think it was in the 2016, late 2010s, 2016 or 17. If someone can find the link and put it in the chat. So there already is existence of such a report. And I was very surprised when I came across that, because yes, public health officials do care a lot about walking, but they look at it from the perspective of physical activity. But here is someone who's leading the charge on public health in the country, and they're explicitly calling for the design of more walkable communities, which is something that has been confined largely to urban planners and folks interested in transportation.
Thanks. Let me give the floor to John for the Q&A. John, please.
Super, thanks. Lots of questions. Let me just start first with methodology. So there was a cluster of questions early on. Joe Conroy asked, how was your data captured and from what sources? Henry Kelly asked, did you use cell phone data? Ariel Neumann asked, did you use replica? Andres, you shared a slide that had your data sources. Maybe if you could just quickly pull that up again and maybe double click on that. It seemed like that might have been covered a bit quickly. What were the data sources?
I can flip back, but in the meantime, I can also just explain that. So
Yeah.
there are data sources on the built environment and travel behavior side, and then there are data sources on the actual pedestrian counts. We do not use any of these mobile phone operator data sets in this study. So all of the pedestrian count data comes from visual in-person counts on streets and intersections throughout New York, usually commissioned by DOT for various impact studies that they've done over the years. So none of it is replica or street light or other mobile phone counting. The land use data, nowadays it's actually fairly easy in North America to get almost address level land use data. So we know business establishment locations, school locations. We can interpolate population estimates down to building level with some caveats from block levels. We can pinpoint where jobs are located, where parks and other open space destinations are available. So this data is, at least in the North American context, pretty easy to get these days. And then the assumptions part about travel behavior that go into the model too. How much trip generation do we expect? What kinds of trips happen during different times of the day? That has been perhaps the greatest challenge data-wise, because a lot of historic data on this is for driving. So we have really extensive trip generation tables from IT for driving trips around the country, not very good ones for walking or cycling. And they're starting to emerge. Data collection standards have changed. More cities are encouraged to collect on that. But we basically mix and match from various sources, from American Time Use Survey, from mode share to work on ACS data, from sometimes even conversations with city planners in the local cities, like, okay, what kinds of trips do you think are occurring in your city during the lunch period? What are the most important types? So this is a kind of an art and science where we try to guesstimate what are most important trip types, and then once we put in the model, we can see in the calibration phase which ones are actually correlated with the counts of pedestrians on the streets, and then those trips that don't have any relationship or are very weakly correlated with the actual counts drop out of the model.
Excellent. Okay, I think you just answered a question from Robert Viola as well. So I will go to question from Akar Mehra. He says, how do you model the pedestrian flow whose destination is the subway stop, but they stop for coffee or breakfast in the morning? Is that not a key factor for this model?
So there are two types of models. For those of you familiar with LUTI models, there are trip-based models and activity-based models. This model is a trip-based model, so there's individual trip legs. So for instance, there's a trip like home to amenities, and coffee shops are part of the amenity destination set. There are retailers and restaurants and coffee shops and the like. And there is a separate trip type from amenities to subway stops. So they would be modeled in this model as two separate legs with a stop, I guess. activity-based models take the whole sort of daily itinerary of a person's schedule and try to model that as a kind of a sequence of trip legs in one go, sort of home to coffee shop to metro to work to pick up at school, back to home, etc. We don't do the whole cycle of a person's daily activity schedule in this model at this point.
Excellent. Okay. This one is for Ronak. So Alain Chiaradia asks, what is the effect of hot and cold weather? And you mentioned this a little bit, but why don't we extrapolate this to the extremes? So if we could reflect, for example, on a city like Montreal, extreme cold, 20 miles of underground pedestrian tunnels, maybe in the other direction, extrapolate to a city like Dubai. What observations would you share with the group in terms of these kind of extreme weather location cities?
Yeah, we can look at this in a couple of different ways. One is just trying to understand at a high level how weather extremes, seasonal or even within a particular season, let's say like particularly hot days during the summer, right? If you have a heat wave, how does that affect travel behavior overall? And we can focus on walking trips and understand if people are shifting their routes, they're seeking out more shaded routes, are they canceling trips? Are they shifting their trips to different times of the day? Something I used to do in Singapore was I used to start earlier in the morning to avoid the sun and then stay until later in the office. I got a lot of work done. Probably wasn't good for my overall work-life balance, but the weather did help in making me more productive. So we can look at it that way. And then specifically for this sort of model, we can make adjustments to our trip generation rates by embedding measures of the microclimate into the network attributes, right? So we know that there's going to be a spatial distribution of the microclimate. Not every single neighborhood or every single sidewalk is going to feel equally hot. So if we have that embedded as a network attribute, we can use that to adjust how we route trips, and that's going to affect our overall volume estimates as well.
Andres, anything to add on that topic? I mean, you make the point about it's the perception of walkability that influences people's paths that they choose.
Yeah, I mean, I would just build on that and say the temperature and climate comfort, which are a fairly large area of research now, especially for pedestrian travel, are just like many other features an attribute of a sidewalk or a link that affects its perceived distance. And so just like, for instance, a wider sidewalk may increase a person's willingness to walk that route, a more comfortable environment or temperature has the same effect. And so we can, certainly factor that in, as Ronak said, as attributes to the perceived length of each link.
And Andres, just quickly while we're on the topic of perceived distance, we've seen some studies that, when you pull into a Target or a Walmart and you can see the store, people perceive that it's right there, but they actually walk longer than if they were to pull into a nice sort of, downtown area and find street parking and then walk to the store. Does that resonate with you? You've seen those studies? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a perfect example of how it's not the people, it's the environment that makes or reduces walking in so many American suburbs, which is, people will spend 15 minutes circling a shopping center to get the nearest parking to the door and to reduce that walk to the bare bone minimum possible. But once they get in the door, they will spend 2 hours walking around the shopping center, getting their 10,000 steps a day. And this is just, it's not the person who doesn't want to walk, it's the environment that's utterly unwalkable.
Right. Okay. Let's move into some other areas. So Brandon Barry asked, I've heard that as we move toward autonomous vehicles, we will see less parking lots and cities will become more walkable because less space will be needed for stopped cars. Is this something you have considered and are planning for with so much robotaxi coming to the market? So I don't know, Ronak, why don't we start with you and over to Andres and to Jascha as well, who's thought about this quite extensively, I think.
Well, I'll let Andres and Jascha comment on that. I'll pivot the topic slightly to the food delivery robots that we see on our sidewalks and just throw
Yeah.
this out there. I'm not a fan of them, but I do think this could be leveraged as an opportunity to collect better data on sidewalk infrastructure, both in terms of the network itself, as well as pavement condition, neighboring, let's say, obstacles like utility poles, trees, and so on. So that's probably a startup idea for someone in the audience.
Excellent.
I'll maybe
Andres?
just add that, in fact, this is happening already. I'm originally from Estonia. One of the big startups there is Starship, which does delivery robots. And one of the things they do is they map sidewalk data very precisely, even the sort of uneven surface data. The problem with that is, of course, they have to be regulated and compelled to share that data, because all of that data currently stays in the company, and it's hard to use. On the topic of AVs, I mean, I really think that it comes down to how we as society regulate their operations. Of course, it's an attractive proposal to say it's going to be less parking, and safety records are going to be so great. It's going to be all nice. I mean, we all know the induced demand flip effect of AVs. And if you imagine, a tripling of traffic volumes in a city because how easy it is to get everywhere by an AV, then there's a lot to be concerned for pedestrians. And I think we have to early on absolutely enforce the standards that we will make no concessions in dense urban environments to separating pedestrians out of the roadways. Peter Norden, who's been on this forum before, has written extensively on how traffic regulations came to be put in place in the first place, in the first wave of motorizations in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And he very nicely articulates how even the concept of jaywalking on a street was, in fact, popularized by automobile clubs in California and elsewhere in order to get people out of the way so cars could drive. I mean, I can see a million scenarios of that occurring again with AVs, and lots of pressure on city governments to make way for AVs. And I think it's really up to us as society to ensure that we do not compromise on the quality of the built environment for walking, who should really be at the top of the priority pyramid on the street.
Yes, excellent point. Jascha, any thoughts?
I just want to echo that last point that Andres made. I mean, there's such an interesting potential future set of policy scenarios, and obviously this topic could be its own forum. But I think the reliability of AVs to not hit people is wonderful from a safety perspective. It also creates a very interesting set of incentives for pedestrians who potentially feel more freedom to walk when and where they want to walk, up to a point where that may induce a sort of policy backlash, as I think Andres was referring to, this idea that we need to further physically separate AVs and pedestrians even more than we do today, because pedestrians no longer might have the fear factor as a thing that kind of keeps them in their place, as it were, from the perspective of the AVs. But I think Andreas's perspective of this, especially in our dense urban cities, pedestrians should be at the top of that pyramid, really thinking about policy frameworks that prioritize pedestrians, that perhaps hamstring the way AVs would like to operate in order to do that. Thinking about that both in terms of the dynamics of crosswalks and roads, but also simply the spatial allocation, right? We've already seen Waymo has essentially said, well, we pull over into bike lanes because that's what our customers expect. And there's no way for us to unload where people want to unload if we're not stopping in a bike lane. That same, which is a huge problem for cyclists, the same issue will exist with pedestrian infrastructure, stopping in the crosswalk, blocking the ramp, right? So a really robust regulatory framework is going to be necessary that puts pedestrians at the top and ensures that we are not kind of bending to what will be the inevitable policy pressure to make life more convenient for the corporate fleets and less for the people on foot.
Very nice. Just on the last point, about 10 years ago, when we were working with Transport for London, at that time, just imagining what AV could look like for the city, that's way long ago. At that time, we actually embedded a particular policy for AV to encourage AV to serve these very short trips. So if it's 100 meter, 200 meter, people should walk. You shouldn't design AV to purposely something like that, right? And also, there are a long time the transportation professional, I have this dream of providing people with door-to-door service. I would argue that if we really realize that dream someday, that will be disaster for public health. This, right? So, thank you so much, Andrew, Jascha, and Rounaq for joining us today. It's an amazing discussion and presentation today. Everyone will join me. Thank the panel for this discussion. Great.
Thank you for hosting.
For the panel, please stay for a bit. We'll have a breakout room. For the audience, thank you for joining us. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next Friday. Bye-bye.